In many modern fantasy stories and alike, we can see supernatural elements like powerful magic, spells, curses, and prophecies. The stories of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings definitely influenced modern works, with the wise, long-bearded old man carrying a staff and probably wearing a big pointy hat. But if you think about it, magic is actually rarely used in Tolkien's works, and it seems there are only 5 wizards in Middle-earth. Most famously, we have Gandalf the Grey with his big pointy head, the kind old man that visits the Shire from time to time and is famous for his brilliant firework. We have Saruman the White, the mysterious old man residing in the ancient black tower Orthanc in Isengard, guarding the Gap of Rohan. He is the leader of the wizards and even the powerful seek his advice. Note that the R in Tolkien's languages is in most cases rolled. You will hear that quite often in this video. We have Radagast the Brown, a strange old hermit living in the forests in harmony with nature. Not much is known about him. And we have the 2 mysterious Blue Wizards who wandered far to the east. But who actually are those men? As always in Tolkien's works, the answer to this is quite complicated and surprising. The group of the 5 wizards is called the Istari in Quenya, which means something like those who know. In this context, it is quite interesting that Tolkien deliberately chose the term wizards for them, because the word wizard itself includes the Middle English word wiz, which means wise. These are the men who know, so to say the wise, and this is quite fitting for what they have to do on their mission, but we come later to this. All the known Istari, I would assume the same goes for the 2 Blue Wizards, seem to be old men, but actually they are no men, they are Maiar. If you have seen some of my other videos, you know this term, but for all who don't, here a short explanation. Besides elves, dwarves, men, including hobbits and orcs, in Lord of the Rings there is another species called the Ainur. Those are powerful spirit entities that existed before the world was created by the god of the Tolkien universe, Eru Ilúvatar. Eru created them to help him shaping the world through the so-called music of the Ainur. You could say they are like angels. They are also divided into at least 2 known groups. First we have the Valar. They are only few, but the most powerful Ainur, like angels of higher rank and direct helpers of Eru. They influenced the shape of the world to a massive extent and are comparable with the god pantheon from other ancient mythologies. And then we have the mentioned Maiar, who are like angels of lower rank and other helpers or servants of the Valar. Even though I said they are spirit beings, they usually choose a suitable physical form and can even change it. When they lose it, this can result in a huge loss of power, but of course they are immortal, so they have a physical component and mostly live on the western continent Aman, probably in Valinor. That is also where the elves are going when they sail to the west and leave Middle-earth, or where their spirits go when they die and where they can get resurrected. And with this, the nature of the Istari becomes a bit more clear. They, as Maiar, are servants of the Valar and are sent on a secret mission to Middle-earth to help the people there against the powerful and evil Sauron, who is a Maiar himself and the servant of the evil Valar Morgoth, the creator of orcs, dragons, balrogs, who are also Maiar, and all sorts of terrible beings. To be precise, Morgoth did not fully create them, he just altered the form of existing beings into these terrible things, because he can't create life on his own. Only Eru can do this with his so-called secret fire or flame imperishable. You probably remember Gandalf saying on the bridge in Moria that he is a servant of the secret fire to the Balrog, calling him Flame of Udun. Udun is one of Morgoth's mighty fortresses during the Years of the Trees, so even before the First Age. If you watched Lord of the Rings carefully or read the books, you see what a powerful entity a Balrog must be. Gandalf manages to defeat him after 10 days of battle, but died himself. Strangely, Gandalf did not really look that powerful before, but both are Maiar. Why is only the Balrog looking so frightening and powerful, appearing as an entity made of shadow and flame? The reason for this is a little extra detail to the mission of the Istari. To explain this in depth, we would have to go back to the First Age and go through centuries worth of events and stories I have partially explained in other videos already. So if you want to know those stories in more detail, maybe check the first parts of the Sauron lore video and the Glaurung and Ancalagon part of the Dragon's lore video. The lore of the First Age and before is always very complicated, but here's an extremely imprecise short version. The Valar Melkor, or later known as Morgoth, once tainted Middle-earth with his evil. It was him who found the elves first when they awoke, and he also found men first when they awoke, giving them a hard time and trying to corrupt them. Over the centuries, things escalated and the Valar rarely interfered until Morgoth was troubling elves, men and dwarves to an unbearable degree, so that after the bidding of men, and you could say elves, the Valar had to do something. And so they came for help, and a giant war called the War of Wrath started at the end of the First Age. The entities clashing in this war were so powerful that it changed the shape of the continent Middle-earth, with its west coast called Beleriand being destroyed and sunk into the ocean. Morgoth was captured and banned into the void, but his highest servant Sauron escaped and should become the new Dark Lord until his master returns. However, the Valar probably decided to not interfere on that level anytime soon again, probably so the world does not get destroyed further. Realizing that Sauron, even though he was a very different evil compared to Morgoth, became very powerful and was almost able to conquer whole Middle-earth, they decided to send some special agents to aid and help the peoples of Middle-earth, the Istari. The Valar did not want their emissaries to go with their complete divine power, challenging Sauron directly, but instead go a very subtle path, though they had to take the form of old men, weakening themselves and becoming like men, even able to bleed, wandering Middle-earth in secret and aiding elves, men and dwarves with advice, wisdom, farsight and knowledge of the world and Sauron instead of sheer power and force. Remember, Istari means those who know. We can read about them in the unfinished tales, mighty peers of Sauron, yet forgo might and clothe themselves in flesh. Only few in Middle-earth actually knew about their true nature. One of those who knew was Lord Círdan, the elvish shipwright in Mithlond. Also, Círdan deserves a lot of praise. He is one of the elves that is not often mentioned and only an extra in the movies, but he deserves a lot of credit for his actions and foresight throughout the ages. Now, with all this said, we can have a look at the 5 Istari and what they did before they came to Middle-earth. Saruman's name in Valinor was Curumo. He was a powerful Maya of the Valar of smithing Aule, together with his old friend Mairon, who later should become or be known as Sauron. It's quite interesting that the two probably knew each other and have served the same Valar. This also explains their extensive artifact knowledge, though it seems Sauron clearly surpassed him when it comes to crafting. Curumo was chosen by Aule to go on this mission, probably volunteering at the Council of Manwë. Manwë is the leader of the Valar, comparable to Zeus, and so Saruman became the first of the 5 Istari. Then we have Radagast, or as he is known in Valinor, Eywendiel. He is obviously a servant of Yavanna, the Valar of nature. Saruman did not want to take Radagast with him, but he had to please Yavanna, the queen of the earth. He was probably the last order to go on this mission. And we have Gandalf. His name in Valinor is Olorin. He is a servant of Manwë himself, but has served other Valar before, like Varda, the Lady of the Stars and Queen of the Valar. She is Manwë's wife, but also Irmo, the Valar of Dreams, and Nienna, the Lady of Pity and Mourning. Gandalf learned much from her, like pity and patience. He was also considered one of the wisest of the Maiar. With so much credibility, Manwë suggested him for this mission, but he did not wish to go because he feared Sauron. But Manwë saw even more potential in this fear and ordered him to go as the 3rd Istari. And then we have the 2 Blue Wizards. The Valar Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, chose LotR as the 2nd Istari. he brought Pallando as his friend with him. They should become the Istari General.min, which means the Blue Wizards. A reason why they are associated with Orome could be that he had the greatest knowledge about the Far East regions of Middle-earth, and that is also where the Blue Wizards should go. Orome found the elves after Morgoth, as mentioned, and probably initiated the elves' great journey to Aman, so they would not be under Morgoth's influence anymore. I explain this in more detail in my Sauron video, where I also talk about the war for sake of the elves and the great journey of the elves. It is also important to note that the names of the Blue Wizards are not mentioned in the main works of Tolkien. Tolkien wrote some notes about the duo, but never published them, only parts of it in letters. Fortunately, his son Christopher Tolkien would later publish them, so they were probably a bit work in progress, and that is why only few things are actually known about them and why some parts contradict each other. And these are the 5 Istari chosen by the Valar during the Council of Manwë. As mentioned, there were some conflicts in this group. The leader of the Istari, Saruman, didn't think much about Elendil and had to take him with him against his will. In addition, Saruman was jealous of Gandalf. He was still the leader, but Gandalf's credibility and potentially strong position was probably trouble for him, even though Gandalf behaved very wisely and tried to work together with him as good as possible. About Saruman's relation to LotR and Pallando we don't know much, but we know that Saruman initially also went to the east of Middle-earth like the Blue Wizards. Maybe they had similar goals, or he was more willing to work together with them. Now with the members chosen, the Istari left Aman and sailed to Middle-earth around... Well, here the chaos begins, especially when it comes to the Blue Wizards. Originally, they all arrived around 3rd Age 1000, but Tolkien later changed his early concept completely and made the Blue Wizards arrive during the 2nd Age, when the Rings of Power were forged and the War of Eriador was on its way. So let's talk a bit about the Blue Wizards, which is probably quite interesting because they are the least known. A little warning. I will cover each Istari separately, but their stories are often tied to each other, so I will repeat myself a bit in each section, but I try to focus on different details every time. In Lord of the Rings only Gandalf, Saruman and Radagast are mentioned, but when Gandalf the White confronts Saruman at the doors of Orthanc, the latter reveals that there are a total of 5 Istari, so 2 more, but they are not mentioned by name. In the Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien published notes of his father. Here the 2 missing Istari are introduced as the Istari General.min, the 2 Blue Wizards. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien originally planned to provide some information about them, probably in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings publication, but that never happened. From these notes we know a few things. There was the mentioned Council of Manwë in Aman. 5 Istari were sent. The Blue Wizards were chosen by Orome, at least LotR was. He was the 2nd Istari and sent to the eastern regions of Middle-earth. It also seemed that all arrived around 3rd Age 1000. In Tolkien's letter 211, he mentions that his plans for the Blue Wizards are not really fleshed out and suggests that they have failed their mission in the East and became founders of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. So in this early version they failed, as most of the other Istari, with Gandalf being the only exception, to some degree. However, for the History of Middle-earth book, The Peoples of Middle-earth, he managed to find more information in his father's notes and published his results. It seems that he later changed his idea about the Blue Wizards failing their mission, saying that they actually were successful and had great impact in the east, weakening Sauron's Easterling forces so they could not outnumber the forces of the west. What's also quite interesting is that the Blue Wizards now arrived with Glorfindel in Middle-earth. Glorfindel was an elf who fought in Gondolin during its fall in the First Age, close to the mentioned War of Res. He sacrificed himself and managed to defeat a Balrog, but got pulled by the evil entity and both fall to their deaths. The elf was allowed to leave the halls of Mandos, that is where the spirit in Tolkien's universe usually goes when someone dies. getting, so to say, a new body. In addition, he received new powers and was now more like a Maya. Later, he was sent to help Elrond in the War of the Elves and Sauron in Eriador, when Sauron forged the One Ring and started to conquer Middle-earth, also to get the Rings of Power back at around Second Age 1600. According to Tolkien's later notes, the two Blue Wizards arrived together with Glorfindel and at this time were known in the eastern parts of Middle-earth as Morinechtar, which means Darkness Slayer, and Romestamo, which means East Helper. Of course, their task was different from Glorfindel's and, as one of the names indicate, directed to the east of Middle-earth. After the Blue Wizards arrived, they wandered to the far east and were not known in the west at all, which is why they have no names there. In the east, they successfully helped eastern tribes who resisted Morgoth and Sauron, which resulted in weakening the eastern forces, who otherwise would have outnumbered the west in the Second Age, for example, when it comes to the Battle of the Last Alliance, and in the Third Age, when it comes to Sauron's countless activities in the War of the Ring. It also seems like they searched Sauron when he hid in the east after he lost his One Ring to Isildur, but they failed to find him. And that is pretty much all we know about them. It's a bit sad that Tolkien never finished their story. It's also quite interesting that Gandalf mentions the two Blue Wizards in the first Hobbit movie, because they are only known as Blue Wizards from sources other than The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. But Middle-earth Enterprises, the company who has the movie rights, only has rights for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So they built in a little reference here. Knowing that their relationship with the Tolkien estate is not the best, I'm curious if that brought them some trouble. Speaking of Tolkien's main work, there is also the famous wizard Radagast the Brown, who is known in Aman as Iwendil. He is a Maya of Yavanna, queen of the earth, so he's definitely close to nature. As mentioned before, Yavanna begged Saruman to take Iwendil with him. Saruman had no choice, but he was not a fan. We come later to that. Radagast arrived most likely together with Gandalf in Mithlond around 3rd Age 1000. As mentioned, the Blue Wizards already arrived during the 2nd Age. While Saruman tried to aid men and Gandalf the elves, Radagast was close to the wildlife and nature and probably got lost there a bit. Gandalf says about him that he was never a traveler unless driven by great need, so it makes sense that Radagast settled somewhere and did not roam Middle-earth constantly like the others did. His home was Rosgobel, which is located between the Carrock, that's an eyot in the river Anduin, and the Old Forest Road at the western borders of Mirkwood. Beorn from The Hobbit lives somewhere in this region too, and Radagast visits him from time to time. The Skin Changer mentioned that he is not bad for a wizard in the Hobbit book. What is interesting in this context is also that Rosgobel is relatively close to Dol Guldur, and with this close to where Sauron hid later. Of course, nobody knew it was Sauron for a very long time, but it can be assumed that Radagast kept an eye on the necromancer's activities in the forest, which was slowly flooded by his evil. Maybe it was also him who called Gandalf's attention to further investigate the strange things going on in the forest, but that is just a theory of mine. It is stated in the Silmarillion that Gandalf actively tried to find out what was going on there, while Saruman, the White Council, and also Radagast seem to be more passive in this regard. If you have seen the Hobbit movies, all this should sound a bit familiar, but they tell the story a bit differently. Even before the White Council formed, Gandalf visited Dol Guldur, 3rd Age 2063, and tried to find out what was going on there, but the necromancer feared to be revealed and retreated to the far east for almost 400 years. This time span is also called the Watchful Peace. When Sauron returned to Dol Guldur at around 3rd Age 2460, the White Council was founded and summoned by Galadriel, 3rd Age 2463, probably as in response to the necromancer's return. They were at least aware of him, even though it took them quite long to decide on what to do. 400 years later, Gandalf finally checked this place again, and this time found Thrain imprisoned there, who gave him the map and the key to Erebor, which led to the events of The Hobbit. Gandalf also confirmed that the necromancer is in fact Sauron. Then Gandalf returned to the White Council and suggested to attack now, but Saruman disagreed and convinced them that the One Ring was dragged into the ocean, not a threat anymore, and that they should stay passive for now, watching Sauron carefully. The part with Gandalf being captured is not in the books and does not work lore-wise. And here we slowly come back to Radagast. Why was Saruman against attacking when he knew Sauron was there? During this time, Saruman in secret searched this area and the Gladden Fields for the One Ring, because he wanted it for himself. His plan was to give Sauron enough time and with his strength so the One Ring would reveal itself again, so it could get back to its master, but he would be there first. Of course, he did not tell anyone. To Saruman's surprise, at some point Sauron's forces were also looking for the One Ring in the Gladden Fields, and so Saruman became alarmed and had to withdraw from there. Saruman now asked Radagast for help, and he helped him out with birds and beasts to spy on foes and this area, continuing to search for the One Ring himself. But why did Radagast help Saruman in his evil deeds? The answer revealed some characteristics of this character. He was quite naive, not able to see through Saruman's plans, and was manipulated by him. Much later, Saruman gave the task to Radagast to search for Gandalf and to ask him to come to Isengard. When Gandalf talked to Saruman in Orthanc and reported that Radagast had told him about the movement of the Nine and his concerns, Saruman revealed his scorn against Radagast, calling him Radagast the Bird Tamer, Radagast the Simple, Radagast the Fool. And here is the most interesting part of this quote. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him. Saruman used him to achieve his goals, like getting access to Radagast's beasts and birds to spy for him, or luring Gandalf to Orthanc, while Radagast thought he was actively working against Sauron. Gandalf also remarks Radagast's honesty, and that he could find no wrong in his eyes or voice, else he would not have visited Orthanc. Radagast was acting on good faith, and maybe it was even him who asked Gwaihir, a friend of him and the swiftest and greatest of the giant eagles in Middle-earth, if he could bring news to Orthanc. And so Gwaihir found Gandalf on the top of the Black Tower and rescued him, which is an interesting irony that Radagast, who was used by Saruman, accidentally rescued Gandalf, but it is not directly stated why the eagle flew over Isengard in the books, but if you read between the lines, it seems plausible. In the movies, it is Gandalf sending a moth, probably directly to Gwaihir. After those events, nothing more about Radagast is mentioned. Around the time of the Council of Elrond, Elrond's scouts looked for him, also in Rosgobel, probably to invite him to his council, but they could not find him. How big his part in the War of the Ring was is hard to say, but at least saving Gandalf can be considered as quite important, even though it was probably by accident, so to say. With all of this, we have already talked a bit about Saruman, and I think it's a good idea to look at him before we talk about Gandalf. It's a bit difficult to separate these three Istari because the actions are often connected, so I have to repeat myself a bit. Saruman, but of course also Gandalf, is in contrast to the other three Istari a very fleshed out character, and because you can see their actions in the movies or read about them in the books, I won't go through every detail we know from these, but talk about the details that are less known, their background, some book and movie differences, and some interesting references to the main stories. As mentioned, Saruman, or Kurumo as he was known in Aman, was a Maya of Aule, like Sauron once. It is stated that Saruman had the most knowledge about the Dark Lord's devices, probably because of their time as servants of Aule, possibly even knowing each other. Also, Saruman studied the Rings of Power and the One Ring a lot in Middle-earth, and as a servant of Aule, he had without a doubt knowledge about jewel smithing and artifacts. When we look at the foundation of the Istari in Aman, we can already learn a few things about his character. Saruman loves order, is ambitious, pride and self-confident. All his names mean man of skill or even the cunning one. He wants to go on this mission. He is the first Istari and becomes their leader. But his pride and ambitions are also dangerous, as they are the root of jealousy and arrogance. When Gandalf has to join the Istari, even though he does not want to go, Saruman fears that Gandalf could undermine his position and weaken his authority in the order of the Istari, because Gandalf was known as one of the wisest of the Maiar and was chosen by Manwë. So Gandalf, or Olorin as he was known in Aman, did not volunteer and did not want to go, but Manwë, the Elder King, leader of the Valar himself, wanted him on this mission. And not only that, Manwë's wife Varda, Queen of the Valar, Lady of the Stars, noted that he might go as third, but he is not. Well, that is a commendation which fueled Saruman's jealousy further, because he feared chaos. Gandalf could disturb the order Saruman wished, and the Istari were sent, or maybe even challenging his position. A great conflict for Curumo. He probably could not see that for this very important mission only the best would be chosen, and he was one of them. Not only that, he was also their leader. However, with this and the 4th edition of Radagast, trouble and the potential of failure was almost inevitable. I really like how Tolkien wrote this conflict into the background stories of those characters. They are meant to help, but start with a conflict among themselves that nearly causes the failure of their mission, and with this, the ruin of Middle-earth. This also explains Manwë's answer to Gandalf, when the latter expressed his fear of Sauron and concerns about his abilities. Manwë answered that exactly this fear was all the more reason for him to go. It is also interesting that the word fear, probably in English as in my native language, can be meant as a concept of respect and being careful, not trying to underestimate something. Like in the expression fear of God, that does not mean being afraid or panicking, but acknowledging a certain distance and respect. And here we see a huge difference in the characters of Gandalf and Saruman. Saruman does not have this respect, distance and carefulness. In this regard, he is the antithesis of Gandalf. He is the man of skill, the leader of the Istari, proud and confident in his powers. He thinks he can play with Sauron or even wield the One Ring himself to bring order. Gandalf is in this regard totally different, which also explains why he is considered the wisest of the Maiar. And I think this contrast makes Saruman such an interesting and important character for the story. You can say his actions are not wise, but they make the story thrilling, giving color to it. And this sentence makes more sense than you might think. We come later to this. Saruman arrived in Mithlond long after the Blue Wizards, but before Olorin and Eowendil. The elves called him Curunir, which also means man of skill. This was around 3rd Age 1000 and is also around the time when Sauron returns from the far east to the northwestern part of Middle-earth after his last defeat. The Dark Lord hides in Dol Guldur, which does not happen unnoticed. Rumors of a necromancer living there spread. The writers probably assume that this is one of the Nazgûl, maybe foreshadowing the return of Sauron. As often mentioned, Saruman was for sure jealous of Gandalf, and many little things happened to fuel this jealousy further. When Gandalf arrived, he got the Ring of Fire, the Elven Ring of Power Narya from Círdan, because the latter understood Gandalf's true nature and could probably foresee the importance of his mission, acknowledging that Gandalf would need the ring more than he did. When Saruman found out about it, he was of course jealous. It's very interesting how many little events like this are placed into the story, and it must have driven Saruman insane. What is also interesting is that he did not stay in the north and western parts of Middle-earth, but journeyed to the far east, where I assume the Blue Wizards were still active. It is not known what he did there or if he met the Blue Wizards, but there is a certain likeliness in it, should they still be on their mission. He was the leader of the Istari, including the Blue Wizards. It would make sense for him to check on their actions and progress, getting some information, maybe even helping out a bit, so he gets a good overview. To quote Saruman, it would be wise. This was also far before Saruman was corrupted. Sadly, it's a bit unclear when he returned from the east. Actually, it's quite confusing, but in the unfinished tales we can read that he continued to travel to the east from time to time, so maybe an indicator for the activity of the Blue Wizards there. However, as mentioned, Gandalf visits Dol Guldur at 3rd Age 2063. Sauron goes back to the east again, and a 400 years long period called the Watchful Peace begins. After this, Sauron returns to Dol Guldur, and probably as an answer, the White Council is established, 3rd Age 2463, at whose foundation Saruman should be present. So in theory, Saruman's east journey could have taken him over 1400 years, but I assume he came back earlier to build a good relationship with the Lords of Men, at least in Gondor, because Rohan didn't exist yet. Maybe he knew the Eortheod lords, which should later found Rohan. We also know that Saruman started studying the archives in Minas Tirith at some point, not all at once, but over time. I would assume that was also after he returned from the east and before the White Council was established, because he became its leader due to his knowledge of the devices of Sauron. Gandalf was also suggested by Galadriel as leader, which Saruman was not happy about, but Gandalf declined the offer. His reasoning is quite interesting. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place nor be subject to any summons. This indicates a bit that Saruman, in contrast, seems to be wandering less and maybe even settled at a place. Note that Saruman would not take Isengard until 300 years later, so I assume he was probably often seen at the same place at this time, maybe in Minas Tirith, to study the archives and build relations to the Lords of Men. We don't know, but of course Saruman still traveled. The election of the chief of the White Council, the acknowledgement of the necromancer in Dol Guldur, and the end of the Watchful Peace were the only things noted about the first council. If you have seen my History of Rohan video, you have heard about the king of Rohan, Frealaf. He drove the Dune landings out of Rohan, recaptured the capital Edoras and the throne, and continued Helm Hammerhand's line as king. Frealaf was his nephew. It is noted that Saruman turned more towards men, in contrast to Gandalf, who loved the elves and was more focused on those, so it makes sense that Saruman had good connections to the lords and kings of men, including Rohan, which was founded 3rd Age 2510. Frealaf became king 3rd Age 2759, so a lot later. Now Saruman saw a good opportunity, because by this time he probably has found out about the remains of the Seeing Stones, the Palantiri. At Frealaf's coronation, Saruman appeared, bringing gifts and praising the valor of the Rohirrim. He was a welcome guest and considered a friend afterwards. Saruman also made a deal. He would protect the Gap of Rohan, which, for example, the Dune landings had to pass to attack Rohan, and Saruman would receive Isengard. Frealaf accepted and recommended this solution to the ruling steward of Gondor, Beren, because Isengard still belonged to Gondor. Saruman became a lieutenant of the steward of Gondor and from that point had the command over Isengard. Both factions were happy with this decision because they knew they had a strong friend with Saruman who brought security to the region. And at this time, Saruman was most likely still a friend in truth on his mission as an Istari. But as mentioned, there's also a reason why he chose Isengard, and with this Orthanc, the dark and almost indestructible tower once built by Númenor. He found out that one of the Seeing Stones is still in the tower and who knows what other secrets, so this was a great opportunity to get his hands on one of those powerful artifacts without anyone knowing. With Isengard and a Palantir in his possession, the ambitious Saruman could establish a great power of his own. And from here, Saruman's path as an Istari starts to derail. The next known event is Sauron capturing Thorin Oakenshield's father Thrain, who was on a journey to Erebor with Balin and Dwalin. The Dark Lord imprisoned Thrain in Dol Guldur and got his ring of power that way, and now had all remaining rings of power of the dwarves back. 3 in total, 4 got destroyed by Dragonfire. With Thrain vanishing in Mirkwood, Gandalf again visited Dol Guldur 5 years later, finding a dying dwarf lord, getting his map and key, identifying the necromancer as Sauron and escaping from Dol Guldur. As mentioned, that is a bit different in the films. With this, the White Council is summoned again in 3rd Age 2851 and Gandalf urges to attack Dol Guldur because Sauron was still weak. Now remember what was mentioned in the passage about Radagast. The cunning Saruman now convinced the White Council that the One Ring was lost in the river Anduin and got flushed into the sea, being no threat, and that they should wait and carefully watch Sauron's actions. The reason for this was that Saruman wanted the One Ring for himself and started searching the Gladden Fields and the river Anduin in secret. Studying the archives, he had a very good idea of what happened to Isildur and where to search for the One Ring, but of course he kept this information secret from the council. Same with his possession of one of the Seeing Stones. His plan was, if he gave Sauron a little bit more time to recover his power, that once it was sufficient, the One Ring would reveal itself, and Saruman, with his advantage in knowledge, would find it before Sauron. So he constantly searched for it and tried to pick up every news and hint that could be related. He knew his plan was risky, but he had the confidence. Gandalf, on the other hand, was not pleased with this decision. In the Unfinished Tales, we can read about a remarkable reference found in the notes of Tolkien that never made it into the books. Gandalf smoked the halfling's leaf from the Shire at this meeting, which he never did before. It annoyed Saruman and they had a conversation. Gandalf explained that it helped him to keep calm and patient, even if angry. At the end of this conversation, Gandalf formed rings out of smoke and grabbed them, but of course they vanished in his hands. In later notes, Tolkien wrote that this made Saruman suspicious and he interpreted it as the Shire having something to do with the rings, which should become true centuries later, and Saruman maybe thought from this on that Gandalf knew it all the time. In a different version of this concept, it was noted, or could be interpreted, as a gesture of Gandalf foreshadowing Saruman's actions to get his hands on the One Ring, and how this led to Saruman's doom. After this, Gandalf left. How canon this is debatable. Gandalf trusted Saruman until the point of his imprisonment in Orthanc at the beginning of Lord of the Rings, and at the time of the mentioned council meeting, the ring was not even found by Bilbo. Actually, he wasn't even born yet, which makes the latter option, it being a gesture towards Saruman's plans, more likely, even though Gandalf probably did not yet see the evil in Saruman. I can see it as a warning out of his anger to not underestimate Sauron and to be careful when it comes to the Rings of Power and the One Ring, which Gandalf knew he studied a lot. We talked earlier about how Gandalf feared Sauron, but Saruman did not. Another interesting side note is that Gandalf probably connected closer to the people of the Shire at this time, because the others had never seen Gandalf smoke pipeweed before, or really knew about it. With these additional information, this was the meeting of the White Council that we have the most information about. Now it becomes quite interesting because Saruman and Gandalf talk far less to each other from this point on and start to make some moves towards their goals all by themselves. As mentioned, Saruman searched for the One Ring all the time, but at one point Sauron's forces appeared near the Gladden Fields too, and Saruman had to retreat. He was actually worried and alarmed that Sauron had the knowledge where to search, which he did not expect, so he retreated to Isengard, fortifying it, and convinced Radagast to help him out with animal spies. Of course, Radagast thought he was helping and working on their mission. He had no reason to believe something different. Spying on the enemy sounded plausible, but in truth, Saruman used the information to carefully orchestrate his plans to find the One Ring and to track Sauron's actions, because he could not let Sauron find it first. A dangerous game he played with the Dark Lord, probably in pure overestimation of his abilities. Of course, all without the knowledge of the other Istari or the White Council. Saruman kept playing his game with Sauron, seeing him as a rival, for some years until he realized that Sauron grew stronger and stronger, and that driving him out of Dol Guldur would actually help him. So in 3rd Age 2941, the White Council meets again, and he finally agreed on attacking Dol Guldur, driving Sauron out. But the Dark Lord has already made his plans and abandoned his hideout. In the movies we have a supernatural fight, but in the books not much is said about an actual battle. Sauron, however, returned in secret to his realm Mordor. What is interesting here is that Gandalf orchestrated the quest for Erebor at the same time. Some speculate to prevent Sauron and Smaug or Smaug to ally. While the dwarves were fighting Smaug, the council fought Sauron to keep both factions busy. This also led to the Battle of the Five Armies, which definitely weakened the orc population, but also the dwarves. Gandalf also participated in that battle, so he was quite busy at this time. The last meeting of the White Council was 3rd Age 2953. They debate the Rings of Power, and Saruman explains that he knows that the One Ring was passed down the river Anduin into the Great Sea, probably because he did not find the One Ring. It is possible that he found the body of Isildur. There are notes about this in the Unfinished Tales. There it is described that Saruman found the golden necklace of Isildur that once bore the One Ring, and the long-lost Elendilmir, the Star of Elendil, the symbol of the kings of Arnor, that was made in Númenor once. It was replaced by a new one made by the elves for Isildur's only remaining son, after the disaster of the Gladden Fields. Some may speculate that Saruman found Isildur's bones and burned them in one of his furnaces with dishonor. After the last council, Saruman returns to Isengard, fortifies it further, and finally declares it as his own. This has also to do with the death of the ruling steward of this time, Steward Turgon. He was the grandfather of Denethor II. As mentioned before, the White Wizard was lieutenant of Gondor until this point, but from now on he separated himself, being now the Lord of Isengard. Saruman also feared Gandalf and started to spy on him. With this, he also found out more about the Shire and established spies and a spy network in Bree and South Farthing. He also started to work against Rohan and Gondor in secret, gathering their enemies, be it men or evil creature. It must also be during this time that he started to influence King Theoden through Grima Wormtongue, who also spied for Saruman. 3rd Age 3000, Saruman started using the Palantir and finally fell under the influence of Sauron directly, with whom he allied. And now slowly the events of Lord of the Rings come into place, but there are a few more nuances. Saruman was not under Sauron's full control. He still did what he wanted and made his own plans. He even later betrayed Sauron, which is also a good example of Saruman's power. He built an army and thought of him and his tower as a rival for Barad-dûr. When he captured Gandalf, the Witch King and the other Nazgûl visited him, and he used his powerful voice to convince them that he had not seen Gandalf or knew about the Shire, and even the Witch King was magically convinced that this must be the truth, a small glimpse at his power through his voice. They found out later when the Nazgûl, probably by accident, captured and terrified Grima. Wormtongue revealed everything to them in exchange for his life, even the location of the Shire. At least we can read about this in the Unfinished Tales. Sauron was definitely not pleased to hear this, but he did not care because he now had a chance to find the One Ring, because he knew from Gollum where it was. Another interesting detail is that when Gandalf the Grey and Saruman met in Orthanc for the last time, Saruman clad himself in a robe that changed its color depending from where you looked at him. He also introduced himself now as Saruman of Many Colors. Earlier in the Saruman part, I mentioned that this character brings color to the story, and here is the reference. He and Gandalf had a conversation about how white light can be broken into different colors and how it would be wise to join Saruman's cause. Quite interesting to read. So he offered Gandalf to join him and was truly sad that his old friend and rival did refuse his offer. He knew what both of them could have accomplished, especially with Gandalf knowing where the One Ring is. In the films, it's not fully clear what Saruman's intentions were, but with all this background story, you probably understand him a bit better. He did not necessarily want to be an ally of Sauron. He even betrayed him by lying to the Witch King, which made Sauron not happy. He wanted to become the new ruler of Middle-earth. In the books, this is more understandable, and you probably now understand why the second book is called The Two Towers. Not the two towers who work together, but the two towers Orthanc and Barad-dûr, who rival for power over Middle-earth. In his efforts, Saruman almost destroyed Rohan, not only from within through Grima or with his orc army, but also with Dunelandings who hated Rohan with passion. In the books, his army was not only orcish, but also had many Dunelandings in it. In the extended edition, we can see this scene here, with a Dunelandish leader vowing allegiance to Saruman. It is also important to note that he had no actual spell on Theoden like in the movies. His voice was powerful and could convince even mighty beings, for example the Witch King, and he probably taught Grima a thing or two. In addition, Theoden became sick, which could be due to Wormtongue poisoning the king in secret. Considering this, Theoden had no chance. In the end, Saruman had no allies left. He betrayed men, elves, Ents, the White Council, the Istari, and even Sauron. His desire for power led to his doom. In the books, Gandalf the White breaks his staff, which is a symbol of his power as an Istari, probably because they were clad in flesh, not having all their divine powers. And he was imprisoned by the Ents, but he still had power through his voice and sought for revenge against the Shire. He managed to convince Treebeard with his powerful voice to let him go. With his spy network, he still had henchmen in the Shire and established partially control over it through sending his evil men. He became known as Sharky and caused a lot of trouble and misery. In the end, during the final confrontation, Grima, who was strongly tyrannized by Saruman so that he became a bit like Gollum and was only called Worm by the others, slit Saruman's throat from behind, before Grima got killed by arrows. This part, called the Scouring of the Shire in the books, misses completely in the films. We can read that Saruman turned to bones very fast and a grey mist rose from his corpse. Then a wind from the west came and resolved it into nothingness. In the far west lies Aman, where the Valar live, who once sent him. He was, like Sauron after his final defeat, punished, lost all his powers and was not allowed to ever enter Mandor's halls. This diminished him to a shadow until the end of time, a fate that he shares with Sauron after the destruction of the One Ring. And finally we come to Gandalf. A lot of his story you can already find in the sections of the other Istari, especially in Saruman's. I try to not repeat myself too much, but it's unavoidable. As mentioned before, Gandalf was known as Olorin in Aman and was a Maiar of Manwë and Varda, but also served Irmo and Nienna. Nienna was the Lady of Pity and Mourning, and it is said that Gandalf learned a lot from her, like patience and the ability to feel pity for others. Probably through this, he was considered one of the wisest of the Maiar. We clearly see the contrast to the pride Saruman. Also in contrast, Olorin feared Sauron and doubted that his abilities were sufficient for the mission of the Istari. He actually did not want to be one of the Istari, but the leader of the Valar, Manwë, ordered him to go, noting that this fear is all the more reason for him to go. In addition, Varda said that he might go as third, but he is not, pointing out his potential and importance, maybe even foreshadowing what would happen thousands of years later. So Gandalf definitely had the potential to be the leader of the Istari too, which Saruman knew and disliked, fueling his jealousy. When Olorin arrived in Middle-earth at the Grey Havens, most likely together with Iwendil around 3rd Age 1000, Círdan, the shipwright, as one of the few people in Middle-earth, knew their true nature when he saw them. He knew that those emissaries of the Valar would need the power of the Elven Ring Narya more than he did, and so he gave it to Gandalf. It is said that it could inspire the hearts of others, and it was of course one of the legendary elven rings of power. With Sauron not having the One Ring, it was safe to wear, and definitely made a difference in Gandalf's work. Looking at the timeline, it can be assumed that Gandalf wanders Middle-earth except for the Far East for a very long time. He loved the elves, another reason why he was chosen, and built connections to the elven lords in Middle-earth. But he also visited men and dwarves and smaller folks like the hobbits later. Elves called him Mithrandir, which means Grey Pilgrim or Grey Wanderer. The men of the Far North, but also many others, knew him as Gandalf the Grey, which means Wand Elf. It's probably Old Norse, most likely because he did not die or change over the centuries and could use magic, so many people thought he was an elf. Later, the people of Rohan called him Greyheim, which means Grey Mantle. But also in the far south he was known as Incanus, which could mean North Spy, but if it's Quenya, it could mean Mind Ruler or even Grey Mantle. In Latin it means grey-haired, which is probably no coincidence. And the dwarves knew him as Tharkun, that's Kustul for Greymen or Staffmen. So Gandalf, as some of the other Istari, had many names, which is definitely an indication for all his traveling. He was known pretty much everywhere, except for the East. It is explicitly stated that he never went there. The reason for this is unknown. Maybe the Istari assigned every member a certain area. It was probably territory of the Blue Wizards and partially Saruman as their leader, but that's just my assumption. There is also the story of the Elessar, a jewel once made in the ancient elven city of Gondolin, probably by Celebrimbor, the elf who later made the Rings of Power. He made the Elessar as a gift for Galadriel. Through various complex events it went to Aman, and there is a note that Yavanna gave it to Olorin, who brought it back to Middle-earth. Gandalf gave it again to Galadriel, foretelling that she would not keep it for long, as she would give it to someone with the same name. And as we know, Galadriel later gifted it to Aragorn, who in the end becomes King Elessar, fulfilling Gandalf's prophecy. What is also important to note is that Gandalf was once a Maiar of Irmo, master of visions and dreams, but not sure how canon the story is. Also, one of Irmo's other names is Lorien, which is also the name of his realm in Aman. But back to Gandalf's early story. Around 3rd Age 1100, the wise became aware of an evil entity called the Necromancer in Dol Guldur. Because of the evil spreading in Mirkwood, Thranduil has to move with his people further into the north. It is also interesting to note that Mirkwood was probably until around this time called Greenwood the Great, but got the name Mirkwood when the Necromancer spread his evil there. Gandalf, as a Maiar of Irmo, often showed a lot of foresight and thought about it being related to Sauron, foreshadowing his return. The strange thing is now that Gandalf is not really mentioned for the next 950 years. He probably wandered a lot and was maybe somehow involved in the big events of the peoples of Middle-earth. We have the Witch King establishing Angmar and slowly destroying the kingdom of Arnor. We have the Great Plague, the Kinstrife, many Easterling invasions, Corsairs of Umbar and Haradrim attacks, the awakening of Durin's Bane, the orcs multiplying in the Misty Mountains, and finally the fall of Arnor. Actually, a lot of things are going wrong, and one could assume that all this must be related to Sauron. As a traveler and usually a quite active part of the later established White Council, Gandalf explores Dol Guldur 3rd Age 2063, as the power there seems to grow stronger, but Sauron manages to escape without being identified. As mentioned in the Radagast part, maybe he has talked with Radagast because he lives in this area. In the Hobbit movies this is also indicated, but in the books Gandalf explores Dol Guldur first, not Radagast. This was also before the White Council was established. It is interesting to note that the name or the concept of the White Council is probably a reference to another White Council that was founded in 2nd Age 1700 after the War of the Elves and Sauron. Elrond and the king of the Noldor elves, Gil-galad, were probably members. Gil-galad gave his Ring of Power via to Elrond at this time, and it's decided that Imladris or Rivendell will be the elvish stronghold of this region and not the devastated realm of Eregion. But back to the Third Age. After Sauron escaped, an era known as the Watchful Peace starts, thanks to Gandalf, but it will end after 400 years. The Nazgûl prepare the return of their master, and so Sauron returns to Dol Guldur, Third Age 2460, with newfound strength, which is noticed after some time, and in response Galadriel summons the Wise to found a new White Council. She suggests Gandalf as leader of the council, but Gandalf declines the offer. But Mithrandir refused the office since he would have no ties and no allegiance save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place nor be subject to any summons. This also points out how Gandalf loved or focused on roaming and exploring Middle-earth. Now, as mentioned, Saruman visited Rohan's king Frealaf at his coronation, setting up the deal to get the keys for Isengard. This was after a very long and harsh winter called the Long Winter. Gandalf aided the Shire during this time and developed an interest and love for the land and its people, Third Age 2758. He explains how he was impressed by the courage and pity for one another while threatened by freezing to death and starvation. Having witnessed these extreme events, he developed a strong connection to the hobbits and knew about their strength of will and courage, probably nobody else knew about. Also, we know that Gandalf probably from this point on visited the Shire regularly and developed a love for pipeweed. Around this time, a young Thorin II, who would later become Thorin Oakenshield, lives in the Lonely Mountain, not knowing about the trouble that will come soon in form of a dragon. The unfinished tales indicate that until the dwarves from the Lonely Mountain lived in exile, Gandalf had not much contact with them. This should change after Smaug invaded Erebor and the dwarves had to find a new home. Thrain, Thorin and parts of their people found a new home in the Blue Mountains, far in the west. After Thror was murdered by the orcs in Moria, the dwarves wanted revenge, and so the war of dwarves and orcs started, ending in the final battle of Adhanul-Bizar. In the end, they decided against retaking Moria because of Durin's bane and heavy losses. Gandalf probably knew about their movements, and we can later read that Thorin heard about Gandalf before, so maybe the Wizard had established a loose contact at this time or traveled through the area in the Blue Mountains. Third Age 2841, Thorin's father Thrain, who was the Lord of the Blue Mountains and possessed one of the Dwarven Rings of Power, the key and the map of the secret entrance of Erebor, started a journey to the Lonely Mountain with Balin and Dwalin. They traveled slowly and came to Mirkwood, where Thrain suddenly disappeared, Third Age 2845. Nobody knew what happened, but he was captured by Sauron and imprisoned in Dol Guldur. What is interesting in this context, nobody knew that it was Sauron hiding in Dol Guldur. Also, this way the Dark Lord gets the last Ring of Power back, which also nobody knew because the Dwarf Lords who had a Ring of Power kept them and their location secret. However, Gandalf searched long for Thrain. In Lord of the Rings he mentions that he even looked in Moria. That is also why he knew the way through Moria later, but the vanished dwarf was not there, and Third Age 2850 Gandalf decides to enter Dol Guldur again. Here he finds a dying Thrain in the dungeons. The tormented dwarf didn't even know who he was anymore, but Gandalf now had the map and the key for the secret door in Erebor. Also, Gandalf was able to identify the necromancer as Sauron himself. In the Hobbit movie, Gandalf is captured, but in the books he leaves Dol Guldur and summons the Council. The Council meets Third Age 2851 and Gandalf the Grey urges to attack Dol Guldur as soon as possible, but as mentioned in Saruman's part, Saruman convinces the Council to stay passive, which angered Gandalf. As mentioned, Gandalf also smoked his pipe during the council, which he never did before, and which annoyed Saruman. Both talked with each other. Gandalf told Saruman a bit about the Shire and made small rings of smoke, trying to grab them, but they disappeared in his hands. After this, he left the meeting. Tolkien never published this little story himself, and we only find it in the unfinished tales, but it's a nice foreshadowing of Saruman's plans, doom, and the involvement of the Shire. But at this time Bilbo was not even born, so it was probably a gesture to warn Saruman that playing with the Rings of Power and Sauron was a dangerous game. He knew that Saruman was studying the rings, but he at least trusted Saruman until he was captured in Orthanc over 260 years later. While now Saruman in secret searched the Gladden Fields for the One Ring, Gandalf started his own agenda. Knowing it was Sauron in Dol Guldur, he started to establish connections to the dwarves and searched for allies. He also visited the Shire. We can read that he knows Bilbo from when he was very young. Also, in 3rd Age 2911, there was another very harsh winter called the Fell Winter. In Tolkien Gateway, we can read that Gandalf and the Dunedain Rangers aided the Shire with food, but I couldn't find that note in the books I use, and there is no source stated for it, but it's possible. 20 years later, Aragorn II is born, and his father Arathorn II is slain. His mother brings him to Rivendell, and Elrond takes him as his foster son, not revealing his true ancestry to him. He calls him Estel, which means hope. It is quite likely that Gandalf knew about him and, of course, who he truly was. He most likely had good connections to the Dunedain Rangers at this point. And with this, we are close to the events of The Hobbit. 3rd Age 2941, Thorin and Gandalf finally meet in person. In Appendix A and in the unfinished tales, we can read that Thorin meets Gandalf in Bree by accident and invites him to his halls in the Blue Mountains, where Thorin tells him his story and seeks his counsel. At least since now or around this time, Gandalf understood the purpose of the map and the key he had. It must also be noted how important this key and map is, and how important it is that Bilbo joins the dwarves on their quest. These events are probably the most important in the history of the whole Third Age, and if just one little detail would have been different, Sauron could have won the war. It somehow feels like Gandalf carefully orchestrated all of this, but in the end he admits in the unfinished tales that he did not really knew from the beginning, but he knew in his heart that without a hobbit the quest for Erebor would fail, and he chose Bilbo because he felt that he was the right one. And so Gandalf's advice for Thorin was the dwarves need to go in secrecy and that he knows the right person to help them out, Bilbo. Thorin was not happy with this advice. He even thought that Gandalf would mock him, but showing him the map and key, Gandalf convinced Thorin, and so the quest for Erebor could begin. While Saruman looked for the One Ring in the background, he noticed that Sauron searched the Gladden Fields too, and so he had to retreat, using Radagast's beasts and birds to spy and search. Soon, the council was summoned again, and Saruman finally agreed to attack Dol Guldur. This was in parallel with the events of The Hobbit. With the defeat of Smaug, Gandalf has managed to weaken Sauron's position, because a potential ally was dead, dwarves would come back to the region and the position of men would become stronger too. In addition, the White Council attacked Sauron in his hideout and forced him to move. This part is actually very crucial. Indeed, Sauron was aware of the attack and escaped easily. Even Mordor was prepared for his return, but in the end it turned out to be a mistake. Gandalf later explains that if Sauron would have gathered all his strength, he could have destroyed Lorien and probably Rivendell. If he had done so, the Ringbearer and the Resistance had no place to go or hide. Instead, he focused on weakening Gondor, which played almost no part when it comes to the One Ring. Frodo never went to Minas Tirith during the War of the Ring, but he was in Rivendell and in Lothlorien. What is also important, the Battle of the Five Armies. Gandalf also participated in this important battle. He probably traveled to help his friends after he and the White Council drove out Sauron from Dol Guldur. The Battle of the Five Armies cost many lives, especially for the dwarves, but it was also a disaster for the orcs in this region. We can read in The Hobbit, songs have said that 3 parts of the goblin warriors of the North perished on that day. That are 75% less orcs for Sauron in the northern regions. A costly defeat for Sauron, because he was now not able to conquer Lothlorien and Rivendell anymore. Gandalf was quite busy in 3rd Age 2941 and probably made the difference here for the years to come. Also, the One Ring went to the Shire with Bilbo without anyone knowing. It was unthinkable, even for Gandalf. In addition, Gandalf's interest in the Shire grows further, especially in the Baggins family, having seen Bilbo in action. The White Council should meet one last time again in 3rd Age 2953. They discussed the Rings of Power, which were now all except for 3 elven rings in Sauron's possession. Saruman did not find the One Ring and claimed to have knowledge of the ring being flushed into the ocean, probably because he found Isildur's necklace and maybe even his body, but not the ring. Maybe he bluffed. Who knows? Saruman fortified Isengard further and should soon start to use the Palantir and fall under the influence of Sauron, of course without the knowledge of anyone. 3rd Age 2956, Gandalf meets Aragorn II in person and they become friends. Both would work together a lot behind the scenes against their common foe Sauron. As mentioned, Gandalf visited the Shire and especially his friends Bilbo and later Frodo quite often from now on. He knew about Bilbo having a ring and might have suspected that his ring could be one of the Rings of Power, probably one of the Dwarven ones. The exact fate of Thrain's ring was actually unknown because the Dwarf Lords who wore it did never speak about it or showed it, and only shortly before they died they gave it to the next heir in secret. For example, at the Council of Elrond, even Dwarf Lords like Gloin thought that the Ring of Thor is still in Moria because Thor died there. This was also one of the reasons for Balin to go to Moria. Quote, "The 7 are lost to us if Balin has not found the Ring of Thor, which was the last." Gandalf at this point had the knowledge and explains that he won't find it there because Thor gave it to Thrain before he went to Moria. I assume that Gandalf did not know about it much earlier too, else his assumption of Bilbo's ring being a ring of power would only make sense when he didn't know about the fate of the other remaining rings, because there are, so to say, no rings of power left. The 9 are with Sauron and the Nazgul, the 3 are with Galadriel, Elrond and Gandalf. 4 of the 7 were destroyed by Dragonfire, 2 were recaptured by Sauron, and the last one had Thrain. But it makes sense that Gandalf for some time also believes that Thor's ring was lost in Moria, because he knew Bilbo found his ring also in the Misty Mountains. An interesting little detail. One reason for Gandalf's suspicion was that Bilbo was quite useful and seemed not to age. He also told Gandalf that he stole it from Gollum. In 3rd Age 3001, Gandalf helped to organize Bilbo's birthday and farewell party. He also asked him to let the ring go, which Bilbo did after struggling, and with Gandalf's help, which is more than an impressive deed. Only few were able to do that, which is a testament for Bilbo's power of will. When it comes to mortals, unheard of. When it comes to the immortal, Tom Bombadil, who Gandalf knew to some degree, would be the only one that comes to my mind. The otherwise did not even dare to touch it. After that, Gandalf became interested in Gollum and started a very long search for him together with Aragorn. Gandalf also started to study the archives in Minas Tirith, maybe catching up with Saruman's knowledge, but he had, in addition through his adventures with Bilbo and the dwarves, information that were not written down, and so a big advantage over all others searching for the One Ring. However, Aragorn and Gandalf were too late. Gollum went or was drawn to Mordor and there was captured and interrogated by Sauron. After he got released, Gollum crossed the Dead Marches, where Aragorn tracked and captured him again. Poor Gollum had some rough times. This was also 3rd Age 3017, decades later. Aragorn brought Gollum to Thranduil and the Wooden Elves, so they all knew each other, including most likely Legolas. There Gandalf interrogated Gollum and now received the missing puzzle pieces, but he also learned that Sauron has captured him before and knew the names Shire and Baggins from Gollum. After hearing all of this and piecing together the information he had, Gandalf knew that the ring in Frodo's possession was not just a ring of power, but the Master Ring itself, the One Ring, and he hasted to the Shire explaining everything to Frodo. Frodo remarks that it would be better if Bilbo would have killed Gollum when he had the chance, but Gandalf reminds him how important pity for others is, and that he feels that Gollum still has a part to play. We all know the beginning of Lord of the Rings. The movies are a bit different though, or let's say time is more compressed. In the books it takes 17 years from Bilbo's 133rd birthday party to Frodo finally leaving the Shire, traveling to Rivendell. As mentioned, Gandalf was quite busy finding Gollum, and he was also prisoned in Orthanc for 2 months. I already talked at length about his meeting with Saruman there. Saruman, as the leader, had the authority and power to imprison Gandalf. The fight we see in the films is not mentioned in the books, but Saruman really wanted Gandalf on his side and was actually sad that he refused his offer. After Mithrandir was saved by Gwaihir, who flew over by accident, probably sent by Radagast, he flew to Edoras in Rohan. Theoden, under the influence of Grima, allowed him to pick any horse he wanted, as long as he leaves as soon as possible. Gandalf chose Shadowfax, one of the Meras, but of course he did not allow Gandalf to just ride him or even come close. Gandalf followed Shadowfax for 2 days until he finally could tame him. Of course he rode Shadowfax without a saddle. Gandalf at this time misses Frodo several times on his way to Rivendell. A thing that is not in the movies is that Gandalf fought the 9 Nazgul at the Weathertop 3 days before Frodo arrived there. Gandalf fought them and later mentions light and flame. He also drew the attention of 4 of the Ringwraiths on him, so that they followed him. That is also the reason why Frodo and his friends were only attacked by 5 riders instead of all 9, which for sure helped the hobbits and Strider. In the books, it is also the mentioned Glorfindel who saves Frodo and rides with him to Rivendell. In the movies, Arwen takes his part, but there are still more differences. For example, Frodo and the horse of Glorfindel, Asphalos, arrived the river alone and the others were following. By the way, Elrond controlled the flood and Gandalf added the horse shapes into the flood, an interesting little detail. Now, this video is already very long and as I said, I won't cover every detail from Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, so we will continue with Moria and Gandalf the White. Gandalf travels with a fellowship over the Misty Mountains and it is his idea to go through Moria, which is different in the films too. Then in Moria we see Gandalf fight the Balrog, both fall into the deep. There Gandalf sees the nameless things, strange unknown creatures from ancient times not even Sauron knew about. The Balrog knew the way to the legendary Endless Stairs, once built by the dwarves of Moria, but lost from history. Even the dwarves thought that they were a legend. He pursued the Balrog up those stairs. They led from the deepest dungeon to the top of the mountain. After 10 days, the battle against Durin's Bane ended with the death of both Gandalf and the Balrog. But how can Gandalf die and what exactly happens to him? As mentioned, Gandalf is a Maiar, but as an Istari was clad in flesh. As mentioned at the beginning, the Valar decided to aid Middle-earth in a very subtle approach. I would say with the death of Gandalf the Grey, a big part of the Istari mission, at least in the west and north, has failed. Saruman has betrayed them, Radagast was lost in nature, and the Blue Wizards worked in the far east and could not help the west and north. What happens now is that Gandalf enters probably the halls of Mandos, maybe reports what he knows, and then was sent back by Eru. He actually is back on that mountaintop naked, maybe a metaphor for his renewal like a newborn, but he does not have to stay there for long. Gwaihir picks him up and brings him to Lothlorien, where he is clothed and gets a new staff by Galadriel, probably still just a symbol of his order and authority. He also calls Shadowfax again. In this new form, he was not clad in flesh anymore and was the sole emissary of the Valar, allowing him to show more of his powers. He was probably still not allowed to use all he got, but you see a far more powerful Gandalf from now on, even though he still holds back and basically continues his old mission. This journey also must have been long, as he needs some time to remember the name Gandalf. In the books we can read how in Fangorn Forest, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli first think he's Saruman and try to attack him. They even see him, so to say, moving around swiftly and moving in supernatural ways, jumping from rock to rock like a Jedi from Star Wars. When they attack him, they cannot harm him, and he explains that in this form, with their ordinary weapons, they can't even hurt him. They also don't recognize him at first. It seems that he can see things in the distance, like Sauron and his plans, more clearly now. His foresight seems even more potent, and he can see events far away. With his new powers, he's able to aid the peoples of Middle-earth as the last Istari of the West, helping Rohan by healing Theoden and finding Erkenbrand. In the movies, this character fuses with Eomer and beating the invading armies. He dispels Saruman from the White Council and the Order of the Istari, breaking his staff and pretty much replacing him after Saruman refuses to go back on track. He also explains that he is Saruman now, or as Saruman should have been. In the end, he has made the difference before and in the War of the Ring. His prophecy that Gollum will play a role in all of this also comes true, as Frodo in the end fails to destroy the One Ring, and Gollum, driven by his desire, bites the ring off Frodo's hand, falling into the lava together with his precious. Gandalf was right. After all of this, his mission is completed and he travels back to Aman in the far west from Mithlond, the Grey Havens, where he and the others once arrived. Thank you for watching.